Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. We are currently reading Chapter 8, entitled Gang Suppression. This is the beginning of that chapter. Malcolm Klein, in his book Gang Cop, tells the story of, quote, Officer Paco Domingo, end quote, a composite of dozens of gang officers. Officer Paco sees the gangs on his beat as a source of serious criminality and attempts to control them through aggressive and punitive interactions that often skirt the law. In a typical interaction, he confronts a group of teenagers hanging out on the corner and searches them without any reasonable suspicion or probable cause. He interrogates them about what they're doing there, then orders them to disperse. He might handcuff them, make them lie on the ground, and order them not to look at him. His goal here is not law enforcement. It's control and humiliation. Gang cops like Officer Paco believe that intimidation is what dissuades young people from gang activity. The dynamic between street gangs and the police looks a lot like a war between competing gangs, with each side using constantly increasing terror to try to show who is toughest. After a relative lull in the 1970s, gangs have become larger, more numerous, and widely distributed across the United States. While Los Angeles and Chicago remain outliers in the intensity and extent of gang activity, other cities are gaining ground, giving rise to a wide variety of police-centered suppression strategies at the local, state, and national level. Hundreds of cities and many states now have dedicated gang units that concentrate on intelligence gathering and intensive enforcement. Many states have also added enhanced legal penalties that play a role in mass incarceration. Despite these efforts, gangs remain alive and well, continually renewing their membership. While the bulk of crimes committed by active gang members involve low-level drug dealing and property crime, violence plays an important role in the cohesion of gang identities and protecting territory from rivals is at the center of much of this destructive behavior. Police gang units emerged as a national trend in the 1980s. By 1999, half of all police agencies with over 100 officers had such units. By 2003, there were an estimated 360 such units, the vast majority of which have been in place for less than 10 years. At the national level, the FBI had established 160 violent gang safe streets task forces staffed by nearly 1,000 federal law enforcement personnel. Gang units tend to take on two main functions: intelligence gathering and street suppression. A few units maintain a largely intelligence gathering function, channeling information about gang activity to enforcement units in patrol, narcotics, and other divisions. Most, however, are directly involved in suppression. Tactics include both long and short-term investigations and random patrols. They harass gang members constantly on the street and in their homes and target them for frequent arrest. These gang units tend to become isolated and insular. Their specialized function and intelligence gathering aspect lead them an air of secrecy and expertise that they cultivate to reduce outside supervision or accountability. In addition, a strong group loyalty often emerges, similar to that seen in SWAT teams, in which experience, training, and the specialized nature of the work contributes to an, quote, us against the world, end quote, attitude. Officers often come to believe that they are the only ones who understand the nature of the problem and the need for heavy-handed tactics to deal with young people who openly defy their authority. They see police executives who embrace community policing and preventative measures as empty suits handing over neighborhoods to the gangbangers and deride non-law enforcement efforts as empty-headed coddling of hardened criminals. In addition, these units often come to play a role in perpetuating the politics of gang suppression. As part of an effort to maintain funding, they spend a lot of their time speaking to community groups about the threats gang pose and the need for more suppression efforts. This tends to be one-way communication. These units rarely take input from communities about where and how to carry out their activities. Instead, it is usually part of a self-serving effort to win more resources and keep up the moral panic about youth violence and gangs, as well as to channel all related concerns into continued aggressive policing. There are a lot of misunderstandings about the nature of gangs, which have come to play a role in the way that police handle them. Strategies that seek to, quote, eradicate, end quote, gangs often fail to consider exactly who the targets for such action are, or the effect on those targeted and on the community. Officials often use language that dehumanizes gang members, such as one LA sheriff's captain who said, quote, everyone says, what are we going to do about the gang problem? It's the same thing you do about cockroaches and insects. You get someone in there to do whatever they can to get rid of those creatures, end quote. This kind of language opens the door to civil and human rights abuses and is unlikely to result in long-term reductions in gang activity. This is exactly what has happened in Los Angeles. For years, the LAPD has embraced a series of suppression measures designed to root out gangs. In the 1970s, the department developed specialized anti-gang units first known as TRASH, Total Resources Against Street Hoodlums, and later sanitized into CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. In 1987, after a series of horrific gang killings, Chief Daryl Gates initiated a massive crackdown called Operation Hammer, in which CRASH units, with the support of other units, carried out sweeps of communities with gangs, with little regard for legal standards for whether those arrested had anything to do with gangs or crime. In one weekend in April 1988, 1,000 officers made almost 1,500 arrests, only 103 of which resulted in charges. Officers raided an entire low-income housing development that they erroneously believed was an epicenter for gang-related drug dealing. When no actual gangs or drugs could be found, officers ripped open walls, destroyed furniture and personal belongings, and spray-painted threatening messages like, quote, LAPD rules, end quote, and, quote, Rollin' 30s die, end quote, on the walls. Dozens were arrested, humiliated, and had their property destroyed, but no one was ever convicted of a crime. By 1990, 50,000 people have been arrested in such sweeps. Current LAPD Chief Charlie Beck points out that these sweeps, quote, undermine the moral authority of the police, end quote. Gang members may have been a source of problem in these communities, but they were still a part of them. They had mothers, cousins, uncles, and friends who viewed the sweeps as the arbitrary, abusive, and disproportionate actions of an occupying army. Many became more sympathetic toward gangs and the young people facing the brunt of this enforcement activity. All the while, crime rates continued to go up, as did excessive force lawsuits against the police. By the late 1990s, CRASH units had become insular, brutal, and unaccountable. The Rampart scandal of 1999 unveiled a pattern of corruption and criminality. Dozens of officers were accused of false arrests, unlawful shootings, beatings, and even robbery and drug dealing. Joe Dominic, in his expose of the post-Rodney King LAPD, details the intensity of this corruption and the utter lack of accountability. Excessive force was routine, so were cover-ups. Shootings and other incidents were only ever investigated by supervisors within CRASH, who often led the effort to make events appear justified on paper. Accounts and paperwork were routinely fabricated in the name of sticking it to the gangbangers. It was within this atmosphere that Rafael Perez and others began stealing drugs from the Rampart Division evidence room and reselling them on the streets. When investigators cornered Perez, he implicated dozens of others in illegal killings, cover-ups, robberies, and drug dealing. Hundreds of prior convictions had to be overturned. Many officers were disciplined or forced to retire. Some were incarcerated. Millions in damages were paid out. Okay, and then let's take a second to reflect on that beginning portion of this chapter. It's not quite to a changing in the theme yet, but we're about 10 minutes in. I want to try to speak on some of the things we just speak about, some of the things we just read. So I think one second. One of the things that one of the things that stands out is when the LAPD chief spoke about how the raids and the sweeps that were done in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 80s and 90s, well, specifically in the 80s, he was speaking about how they undermined the moral authority of the police because of the fact that they did them without the consent of these communities. They were raiding these communities, essentially turning these communities into police states without the consent of the community that they were doing it in. And that made it so that the things that they were trying to do, the things they were trying to enforce, were not being met with reception from the communities that were doing it in. And that's something that is still very relevant to today, that a lot of these communities that are being over-policed, these communities that have been turned into police states, these things happen there that are not consented on by the community members, by the people, by the people in the neighborhood. And that creates a problem of legitimacy for the police. I think that when they spoke about Officer Paco Domingo, the fictional officer, but when they spoke about these realistic things that he does and how other police officers do these things on a daily basis to people, the ordering people to disperse, handcuffing them, making them lie on the ground, not looking at him. These forms of humiliation are still constantly done, are still done on a regular basis. And they're done to dehumanize the people who they're done to. And then the corruption that is pointed out in these gang units is something that I think is very important to speak about and to be able to articulate. And this is now the third chapter that we have read where they speak about the unique corruption that is presented in three different forms of policing, and how people fall prey to these police officers who are doing some of these things. Okay, trying to find where we left off at. Okay, and then I think one of the other things that's important to point out is, and we've seen this with a few different chapters, I think, as well, is that when there are lawsuits waged against these police officers for these actions that they're doing, when people are sued or the city is sued, police department sued, it is the taxpayers who pay out that money. And so not only is it a disservice being done to us as people in this society because these issues are not being dealt with at the root and instead are being dealt with on the effect, or the effects of them are being dealt with, but we also pay the fines when these institutions that are supposed to be dealing with the effects are corrupt, and when they cause traumas as well instead of policing traumas. Okay, hold on. All right, let's continue reading. While police have some useful first-hand knowledge, they too are subjective to pressure by politicians and the public, whose views are shaped by sensationalist media coverage as well as movies and television. Communities directly affected also have some immediate knowledge, but they too are remarkably unclear about the exact role gangs versus unaffiliated youth, and tend to have their views skewed by extreme events, which often then become associated with any group of young people hanging out together in public spaces. A group of middle school kids who hang out together and paint graffiti may be perceived as dangerous, even if they rarely go beyond vandalism and perhaps shoplifting supplies. While more organized gangs often have certain symbols or styles of clothing, these may be difficult for many to distinguish. A lot of property and violent crime are committed by young people, and much of it happens in poor communities, especially Black and Latino ones. Wealthier kids are generally less likely to get caught and more likely to be dealt with informally or leniently if apprehended. The police tend to see most youth criminality in gang neighborhoods as gang-related. They also tend to view gangs as highly organized, directed by central leadership, central to local drug markets, and comprised of hardened criminals. These comports closely with their suppression orientation, which has been amplified by the growth of gang databases, sentencing enhancements, and injunctions. Even in the most gang-intensive communities, only 10 to 15% of young people are in gangs. Research consistently shows that most involvement is short-lived, lasting on average only a year. While some become intensively involved and identified with their gangs, many more have a looser connection and drift in and out depending on life circumstances. Rarely does leaving result in serious consequences. A new child or job are generally sufficient explanation for not being on the streets any longer. Suppression efforts mostly focus on established members of whom police are aware. Police assume that these members play a central leadership role in initiating and directing illegal activity, with younger members playing a support role. They believe that getting rid of leaders will disrupt and destabilize the gang, causing it to either dissipate or at least be less violent. The reality is that for every, quote, shot caller, end quote, or, quote, old head, end quote, that's locked up, there are many more to take their place. The whole idea of one or two leaders directing gang activity is itself a misunderstanding of the horizontal nature of gangs, with many people playing shifting and overlapping leadership roles at different times and in different circumstances. Just as importantly, much of the violence committed by gang members is performed by younger members hoping to prove themselves, who have had no previous contact with the police and are not in gang databases or under surveillance. Another central misconception is that arrest and incarceration will break the cycle of violence and criminality. The fundamental premise is that young people will either be intimidated by the threat of arrest and incarceration, or that removing them from the streets will reduce the number of young people active in gangs and other illegal activities. There is little evidence to support these ideas. Young people seem largely immune to this deterrent effect. Juveniles rarely make such rational cost-benefit calculations. Instead, they tend to make impulsive decisions, think in very short-term horizons, and believe that they will not get caught. Many report that they expect to have very short lifespans and focus on achieving respect and social acceptance on the streets, rather than considering the impact of arrest and incarceration on their futures. It could also be argued that, for some, despite the threat of punishment, the gang may still be the, quote, rational, end quote, decision in circumstances where legitimate economic opportunities are scarce and there is a need for protection in one's neighborhood. And I want to reflect on a couple of things that we just read right there as well. Right here it says, many report that they expect to have very short lifespans and focus on achieving respect and social acceptance on the streets rather than considering the impact of arrest and incarceration on their future. And I think that reminds me of the book we read, Race Matters by Cornel West, and the chapter that he had on black nihilism, and when he spoke about the role that nihilism played in black America and this hopelessness that was beginning to arise in black America in the 90s and in the 2000s, and how that was something that was relatively new because of these sort of neoliberal standards or neoliberal values and some of the conditions that had came across from the war on drugs and from things that the residual effects from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I just bring that up to say that there has to be an understanding of the role of the psychology and the mentality that people in some of these circumstances have. And so before you just get to a place of trying to make it so that people aren't in gangs and trying to make gangs illegal, what the hell is going on? I just took a picture of me. Okay. Before Oof. Sorry, there's some weird stuff going on out here. I think that before we just get to a place of trying to eradicate gangs and remove gangs, just like we have talked about in previous chapters, we have to get to an understanding of the root causes of why people are in gangs, and also the psychology and the mentality of the people that are within those gangs. And there are a portion of young people in our society who feel like their lives are not of value, who feel like their existence is not of value, who are told by society that they aren't of value, or that they're not of importance. And so they find that value and importance within gangs. They find there are so many people who are dealing with broken homes, who are dealing with a lack of attention and care and empathy, and they don't find them in schools. They don't find them. We already spoke about earlier here the changing of the way some of these schools are operated, the emphasis that is put on testing and test scores, and how kids who are seen to be problems are sort of marginalized out of the school and pushed out of the school, or pushed out of certain schools, or the mainstream of the education. I hope I'm explaining this right. And so we know that based on previous chapters that there are children who who don't have resources at home, who don't have care and affection and empathy and understanding at home, who are going to schools and are not finding those things. They're being relegated to school resource officers and police and juvenile and youth programs, and so they find those things in gangs sometimes. Also, we've read about in multiple of these chapters the dangers that exist in some of these communities and the violence that exists in some of these communities, and for the people who are on the margins of society. And so there are people who find protection in these gangs. We've spoken about how the legitimacy of police is something that is that there's a question of the legitimacy of police within certain communities and within certain neighborhoods because of their relationship with police. And so they feel like they can't go to the police for protection from things that are happening in their neighborhood. And so they rely on gangs or look to gangs for that. And so before you can just get to a place of trying to police out gangs from the society, you have to get into a place of understanding why gangs are relevant in this society, and then trying to deal with the root social issues that lead to gangs being relevant in our society. Trying to find where we're at. 1 second here. Okay, let's read a few more passages before we wrap this episode up. Nor do arrest incapacitate gangs. Many are intergenerational, and there are always more young people to fill the shoes of those taken away. Destabilizing existing dynamics of respect and authority can create a power vacuum that encourages more crime and violence as people jockey for prestige. There is also evidence that intensive gang enforcement breeds gang cohesion. The constant threat of police harassment becomes a central shared experience of gang life and contributes to a sense of, quote, us against the world, end quote, in an ironic converse of the police mentality. Gangs often thrive on a sense of adventure. Boasting and fraught encounters with the police become central aspects of gang identity. One way to gain respect is to stand up to police harassment in subtle ways, like flashing gang signs or giving them the eye as they drive past. This use of bravado to gain respect can only be accomplished if police are there as an oppositional force. What's more, the many young people incarcerated by this process are now burdened with a criminal record that makes them less employable. They are generally drawn into prison gang activity, which tends to be even more violent than street gangs. Finally, they have often been abused by guards and other inmates. All of this contributes to hardening a criminal identity. Since all but a few of those incarcerated come back to the community at some point, relying on this approach sets these young people and their communities up for failure. We can see this play out in places like Oakland, California, where young people are subjected to punitive probation and parole policies, policing, and school discipline. Wherever they go, they are hounded by government officials who treat them as always already criminals. The effect is what sociologist Victor Rios calls the, quote, youth control complex, end quote, which undermines their life chances by driving them into economic and social failure and long-term criminality and incarceration. Many cities have doubled down by developing new tools of punishment and suppression, such as multi-agency task force, gang sentencing enhancements, and gang injunctions. The center of these innovations is California, which has extensive gang activity and has also been at the heart of mass incarceration politics and policy over the past 30 years. San Diego's jurisdiction, United for Drug Gang Enforcement, judge, targeted gang members believed to be involved in drug dealing. They intensively monitored those with a past drug arrest and arrested more than 80% of them in a 2-year period. 97% of those arrested were Black or Latino. Much of the enforcement focused on probation violations. Almost half of those targeted spent 6 months or more in jail or juvenile facilities. 4 years after the program ended, 2/3 of those targeted had been rearrested, usually multiple times. Evaluators of the program noted the high recidivism rate as a clear indication of failure and went so far as to say that the program may have done more harm than good, as incarceration is more likely to lead to additional offenses than drug treatment, improved educational access, and employment are. Multi-agency task force, in which local and federal officials work together to develop major cases against gangs, have seen similarly dismal results. In drug cases, this involves low-level buy-and-bust operations to develop informants who then provide information on drug dealers. These dealers are then targeted, and whoever is caught is asked to provide evidence against others in the gang. Strong loyalties mean that often people refuse to cooperate or name others outside their group. Rarely do these investigations move higher up the drug distribution chain. Generally, they have no effect on the availability of drugs or the cohesiveness and impact of local gangs. Susan Phillips points out that incarcerating earners further destabilizes families and communities. Nevada and California have developed sentencing enhancements that add many additional years to sentences based on loose definitions of gang membership. Anyone the police want to assert is affiliated with the gang can find an extra decade added to their sentence. Neither state has seen a reduction in gang activity. The enhancements have further overpopulated state prisons without providing meaningful relief to the youth or their communities. Gang databases are another problematic area of intervention. California has a statewide database populated with the names of hundreds of thousands of young people, the vast majority of whom are Black or Latino. Officers can enter names at will, based on associations, clothing, or just a hunch. There are very few ways of getting your name removed from the list. Many people do not even know whether or not they are on it. In some neighborhoods, inclusion on the list is almost the norm for young men. Police and courts use the list to give people enhanced sentences, target them for parole violations, or even target entire neighborhoods for expanded and intensified policing. The Youth Justice Coalition in Los Angeles has documented cases where information in the database has been shared with employers and landlords, despite legal requirements that the database not be publicly accessible. These databases have made possible another new tool, the gang injunction. These are civil injunctions brought by local authorities to try to break up gang-related activities on a broad scale. Rather than targeting individuals for criminal prosecution, they criminalize membership in or even association with gangs. San Jose's injunction prohibits, quote, standing, sitting, walking, driving, gathering, or appearing anywhere in public view, end quote, with someone suspected of being a gang member. Some injunctions name specific individuals. Others are directed at a gang, and anyone believed by police to be associated with that gang is covered, even without prior notification. Those that violate the injunction are subject to criminal prosecution for contempt of court, which is a misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail. By 2011, the city of Los Angeles had brought 44 injunctions targeting 72 gangs. People can be penalized for associating with family members and lifelong friends, sometimes without realizing it. People who have long since left gang life but remain in the database may find themselves, or those they associate with, criminalized for walking down the street together. Anna Muniz argues that one of the primary functions of these injunctions is maintaining racial boundaries by tightly constraining the behaviors and movements of black and brown youth. Little systematic evaluation of these injunctions has been done, and the studies that exist are far from conclusive. However, most show either no effort or a very short-lived one in which, after a year or two, crime rates return to their previous levels. In one study, the ACLU found that crime activity near an injunction in Los Angeles was merely dispersed and may actually have increased. A gang injunction targeting 2 neighborhoods in Oakland was withdrawn after residents and criminal justice reform groups such as Critical Resistance showed that it did not make these neighborhoods any safer. Even local police officials admitted that the injunction had been ineffective and undermined police-community relations more broadly. Social media-based gang suppression efforts take guilt by association to a new level. The most notorious is Operation Crew Cut in New York City. In 2012, the NYPD doubled the size of its gang unit to 300 officers and began creating fake social media profiles and using them to monitor the activities of people as young as 12 who are suspected of involvement in crime. They attempt to trick these young people into accepting friend requests, often by creating fake profile with images or photos of attractive young women to gain access to secure information. The investigators then use this access to track who is friends with whom in order to draw up extensive lists of, quote, known associates, end quote. These associates then get designated as members of a particular gang or crew. The police can then use conspiracy laws and other measures to round up large numbers of young people under the banner of gang suppression without concrete evidence of criminal behavior, just a social media connection to someone suspected of a violent crime. This is exactly the wrong direction. Law professor Babe Howell argues that New York City's expanded emphasis on gang suppression is being driven by the legal and political pushback against, quote, stop and frisk, end quote, policing. She says that when police lost the ability to engage young people of color through street stops, they developed new but similarly invasive gang policing techniques under a new name. In both cases, black and brown youth are singled out for police harassment without adequate legal justification because they represent a, quote, dangerous class, end quote, of major concern to police. Okay, and then that's gonna be our last thing that we read for this episode. And then on the next episode, we will conclude gang suppression and do a review of the entire chapter. I think one of these passages that is very important to add to our Rolodex or our lexicon here is, one second. Well, okay, I don't know if I can find the exact passage, but it spoke about how the people that they were arresting for gang activity were going to jail, and once they were in jail, they were eventually returning back to their communities, and they were, okay, hold on, let me read it here. One second. All of this contributes to hardening a criminal identity, since all but a few of those incarcerated come back to the community at some point. Relying on this approach sets these young people in their communities up for failure. And I have often tried to articulate to people how dangerous it is to criminalize and to arrest people for things that we deem to be detrimental to society. And then by putting them in a jail or in a prison with a bunch of other people who we think are doing things or have characteristics or traits that are detrimental to society. Because as you know, there's a saying of, you are who you watch, who you hang around, or watch who you are around, because that will become who you are. And that is something that is true there. So if you take somebody who maybe is doing small robberies or small drug dealing, and then you put them around a bunch of people who do big drug dealing and who do other things that you deem to be detrimental to the society, it is more likely that once they get out, they will be closer to the person who you have put them in prison with than they will be closer to in character to the people who are outside in the real world, who you deem to be doing things that are more in cohesion with society. The same thing when you take these people and you stigmatize them, people who are already marginalized, and then you further stigmatize them by labeling them convicts or labeling them felons, when you make it more difficult for them to get jobs, when you make it so that they can't vote, when you further ostracize people from society or further marginalize people from society who are already ostracized and marginalized in the first place, you make it so that they are more likely to engage and continue these type of activities that they were involved in before. And you limit their view of the world. Their view of the world becomes smaller. They view the world more through what you deem to be a criminal perspective, because that's all they begin to know. And I just think that is something that we have to. And I don't know if I'm articulating it well enough here or not, and I want to get ready to wrap this episode up. But we have to be able to point out the dangers one of the dangers of jail and prison is that you are putting people who have these traits or who are taking actions that you deem to be detrimental to society with only people who are doing those actions and have those traits. And does that seem like and when you understand that these people have to come back out at some point, they have to go back to the community at some point, do you think it's more likely that they will be like the people that you have just forced them to be around for 24 hours and 7 days a week for whatever, however many years, or they'll be more like the people that you deem to be cohesive with society, who they have been completely removed from for months on top of years? And that question, that concept is one of the things that gets us into a place where we have to begin to have alternatives to jails and to prison and to policing. So please share this on whatever platform you are listening to it on. Thank you so much for taking out the time to listen to this. Thank you for anybody who has been on this journey with us from the beginning of the first Rockford Reading Daily episode to this one. And thank you to anybody who may have picked up the journey in the midst. If this is your first episode, or maybe this might be the last one you ever listen to, still thank you. And we will be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily.